We're going to start off today looking at Chautauqua Lake from the years 1860 to World War I. Somebody's going to ask, why did you pick those dates? You'll find out as we go along why they were picked as markers. I think there's something that we ought to review a little bit, and that is the importance of the lake as a transportation system up to the 1860s. Many things were transported down the Erie Canal, up over the Chautauqua Portage, to Chautauqua Lake, to keelboats and rafts, and carried down Chautauqua Lake and down through the river. How do you get down through the river when you have dams on it? Well, the history refers to the fact that there were 5 locks in the river, and they were maintained for navigational purposes. How important was this part of Chautauqua County's economy at that time and up to about the 1860s? The Chautauqua County Legislature petitioned to have the elections in late May instead of in February and March because of the fact that most of the people of Chautauqua County were downriver during those periods of time, either on keelboats or on lumber rafts. This goes on until 1872 when they changed the law and put the elections back early in the year. But for that period of time from 1811 through to 1872, the spring freshet was extremely important to the economy of Chautauqua County and parts of western New York. After 1825 and the Erie Canal was completed, product would come through to the canal to Barcelona Harbor, come up the portage, be transferred to a keelboat or a raft, and taken down lake and down through a series of locks. There is no evidence of the lock system anymore. And if you go down Foote Avenue and go by the old Crescent tool plant, you'll see how limited the river has been constricted to in, quote, modern times. 1860, why is that picked? 1860 is picked as a benchmark time in the history of the lake because that's when the railroads reached Jamestown. Railroads reached the northern end of the county in the 50s, 1850s that is, but they did not reach Jamestown until 1860. With the opening of the railroad down past Lakewood and on westerly, something happened to Chautauqua County. Things began to move and change. 1867 and 1868 finds the railroad coming from Corry past Mayville, or through Mayville, depending upon interpretation, to Brockton. And all of a sudden, Chautauqua County is open to the world, and Chautauqua Lake is open to the world. The lake basically was a transportation route, and it was a fishing place. And of course, the people of the county, if they had spare time, recreated on it. But it's the coming of the railroads, and all of a sudden, something dynamic happens on and around Chautauqua Lake. And over on the easel, I have 3 documents that I would strongly recommend to anybody that's interested in the love and enjoyment of this period of time. It's 3 publications put together and published and sponsored by the Fenton Historical Society, and those documents are available from Fenton. I don't know that they're available in bookstores, but you can get them from the Fenton Historical Society in Jamestown. And they record this happy time, this time from 1860 to about 1930 when exciting things are happening on the lake. The peak period is 1880 to 05. Give you an idea of what I mean by that in terms of activity. If they would go back to the easel and look at the table in the graph that's up there, I took the information out of the steamer book and tried to plot the boats that were plying Chautauqua Lake. The upper table shows the small vessels, and the maximum number of small vessels at any time on the lake were 12. The maximum number of large vessels, which is the lower table, you're dealing with 9. So at some point, we have 20 boats zooming up and down the lake, carrying people all over the place. And this goes on until 1886, when entrepreneurs of Jamestown decide that it's time to create a railroad system up the east side of the lake. And by 1888, we have a railroad from Jamestown to Mayville. And this cuts in a little bit on the boat traffic, but not that much. We have hotels that come up like mushrooms, so to speak, in Bemis Point, particularly, Lakewood particularly. 1887-88, the railroads come to Mayville, and in 1888, we have a hotel, the first hotel that is built specifically related to the railroad lake industry. The first hotel, however, on the lake was established in the 1830s at Fluvanna. It was the Fluvanna House, and it was a facility of long life and service. It was a hunt club, in part, in its original establishment. Anyway, we begin to get into this wonderful period of time of boats going up and down the lake and racing here and there. We get a railroad out to Asheville long about the turn of the century. Along with the railroads, we also get an exploding new industry for Chautauqua County. It's called ice harvest. And we begin to see an industry that blooms at a number of points on the lake, all related to the railroad systems, of course. Lakewood, Mayville in particular, are the focal points of this industry. And this industry flourishes until about 1895, when we get commercial scale refrigeration. And from that point on, the ice industry begins to take on a different character, and it finally disappears. If you're interested in the ice industry, there is a publication that was done by Willis Rothra, a small but wonderful book on the ice industry on Chautauqua Lake, and I recommend it to you highly. Where it is in terms of availability and sales, I don't know, possibly the Mayville Library. Maybe it's in some of the bookstores. This is a time of churning and change and change. Give you an idea, vulcanization of rubber, the automobile, 1904, we have a couple of guys called Wright that are flying. We get our first federal aid to highways in 1916, and we've got a rolling change that takes place. But if you're really interested in an exciting and romantic time concerning Chautauqua Lake and where Chautauqua Lake has received its reputation, which lives on to this day, it's in this period from about 1880 to 1905. This is the peak time, boats, ships. If you want to have some fun and listen to some of the wonderful stories about Chautauqua Lake, Norman Carlson has some beautiful stories about floating islands, rock-built islands, boat races, stranding boats, rowing races, and including the fable, or I don't know that it's a fable, but the story of the governor of the state of New York coming to Chautauqua Lake in the early 1880s and being given a ride down the outlet of the lake, and they have somebody in the bottom of the ship pounding on the bottom of the ship to convince the governor that Chautauqua Lake outlet ought to be dredged. And along with a lot of other political shenanigans, finally there is some dredging done on the lake. That's an interesting story in and of itself, and we might look at it for a moment. In the late 1880s, state funds were provided to dredge the outlet of the lake from the boat landing out to approximately what we know now as Bonita, or not as far as Dunham Avenue in the village of Celeron. Over a period of several years, a dredging contract was executed, and they took 180,000 cubic yards of material out of the outlet, and guess what they did with it? They put it in Bertus Bay, a place that really didn't need to be filled in. And then that corporation that owned that dredging equipment spent another 10 years on the lake doing dredging and improving the health of the lake. I find no records as to where they put their fill, but we have looked at the question of dredging the lake in modern time, and there's no problem in picking up dredged material. It's the problem of where are you going to be allowed to put it down today. As an example, when the Sea Lion was constructed and the access to that harbor area was created, there was need for dredging. And finally, the material was hauled up and placed behind the county courthouse and the our Clothier building. But it wasn't allowed until some very important tests were made on the material that was being moved. Going back to the question of the hotels and the activity on the lake, realize that the lake was basically used during this period of time as a recreation thing, but it was also used as a industrial water supply. And in my family's archives are pictures of chicory growing on the bottom of Chautauqua Lake in areas that I have never seen dry as early as the middle of July. So this is one of the things that this boating industry had to deal with. And if you were to look in the books that I've recommended that you read, particularly the one on the steamboats and the hotels, you'll notice that there's one picture showing a dock running out from the end of Dunham Avenue to the, quote, middle of the lake, and the trolley tracks running out to that point to load steamboats. And the literature suggests that the reason that people came to that point was they didn't want to ride the long trip in the outlet to get out onto the lake, that they would get on one of the trams or electric cars and go to Celeron and get on the ship. I have a sneaking suspicion that it could also very well have been that the outlet was rather low, and maybe those boats didn't want to go out fully loaded until they got to Celeron. I'm going to have to chase that idea a little bit further, but I think that may have also played a role in the people going to Celeron to get on the various ships to go to the various places. For years, people were transported from either Mayville or Lakewood or Jamestown by boat to the resorts around the shores of the lake. There really is no dynamic development on the lake, and I'll show you a map in a few moments about how the lake looked about the turn of the century in terms of development. Probably the biggest development that took place about the turn of the century was the development of Oriental Park. And in the county clerk's office, there is a record showing the promenade, the horse bridle path, and the fact that if you sank a well any place in Oriental Park, your well was probably artesian. I'd like to show you the 1904 USGS map. It's going to be difficult, but I'd like to show you the development that was on the lake at approximately the turn of the century. It's very limited. About 7 miles of the 42 miles of the lake are developed at this point. We come out to Celeron. Here's Bertus Bay. That's where they dumped all that soil. Here's what the village of Lakewood looked like. If you're familiar with Viewcoat, which is a thriving development at this point, you'll notice that on this map it's designated as swamp. And it's got to be awfully wet to be designated swamp on this map. Then you see that Cheney's Point was an offloading point, and we come up lake. Of course, we had the ferry running back and forth. The first real ship on the lake that's been here forever was the ferry started in 1811. And then we come up to Chautauqua, to Point Chautauqua. There's nothing in the Hartfield Inlet area. It's all designated as swamp on this particular map. And you come down and you can see how close to the shore of the lake the railroad on the east side of the lake courses. This, of course, does not give you the detail, but in some instances, they actually filled into the lake. Bemis Point was not as developed. Oriental Park was not shown as having any development when this base map information was collected. And then you have the Point Stockholm and the Griffiths area, and Flavanna and Bonita. About 7 miles of the shoreline of the lake were developed at that time to any intensity. We'll look at the lake in the map behind me that was done in 1954, and we'll see the difference in the pattern. And in a later session, we'll look at some aerial photography that shows the development as it existed in April and May of this year. At this time, up through to World War I, Warner Dam, to the best of my ability to figure it out, is a combination timber, earth-filled, over-the-top flow dam. And if they wanted to lower water, they took a board out of the top of the dam. But in many instances, most of the water was conserved to go to the various industries that were using it downstream. And if you look at the early maps and some of the property descriptions, you can see a number of channels that or canals that were built to channel the water of the outlet. Realize that one of the things that our predecessors totally misunderstood was the hydraulics of the lake. They did not understand, except when the lake waters got so low that the lake can't supply water on a year-round basis for most of the industry that was in the Chautauqua Valley up through possibly the turn of the century. After that time, the interests in water usage changed. By this time, they'd gone to other sources of power in most instances. We don't really get people concerned about or complaining about high water on the lake, other than, of course, the original incident with James Prendergast and the flooding in 1811, until 1913 and 1918, when we had floods that reached an elevation, lake elevation of approximately 1313. For reference, the average or the summer lake elevation that we like to think of for Chautauqua Lake is 1308. So we're talking about a lake rise of 5 feet. In both instances, these are associated with the spring freshet. We'll talk more about the spring freshet in later sessions also. The other thing that is happening is, as this development is taking place, is that we're not paying any attention to waste disposal. And in a 1938, getting a little bit ahead, but I'm going to mention it anyway. In 1938, the New York State Department of Conservation comments that the flotsam and jetsam being blown off of the dump at Chautauqua Institution sometimes carries as much as 2 miles away from the lake. I can tell you that there was a dump that was still open on the lake and being annually bulldozed into the lake as late as 1962. That was not Chautauqua Institution, however. But we didn't view the lake as something that we apparently spent much time in. I should really go back, or have somebody go back and talk about the fashion and the acceptability of swimming in general as a social activity And I don't think it had the charm and the joy and the desire for it that we have these days. The people around the lake during this period of time are having a problem with the fish and what is happening to the fish. If you are interested in some of the history of fishing on the lake, the Nortons have compiled a whole series of notes, and they record the daily catches that are taken from the lake and put in the fish markets of Jamestown. During this period of time, a number of things happen that drive what is happening on the lake, and I'd like to mention just a few. If we start in 1860, we have the Bessemer paper on how to process steel in a different manner. We have the discovery of oil in the oil industry that has its birth in 1859, and it rolls into the economy of Chautauqua County and into the lake. Realize that in that same year, that same period of time, the continental United States fills out to its full 48-state continental dimension, and we have no change in that after that. We, of course, go through the terrible, terrible, bloody Civil War of 1861 to 1865. And then we have the Homestead Act of 1862, which opens the West, where you can homestead land for nothing or pay $1.25 an acre for it. This also draws people right straight through Chautauqua County, and we don't see them spending a lot of time here. 1867, a fellow by the name of Nobel gives us dynamite. 1876, the introduction of the steam turbine. AT&T is formed that same year. All of these things are important to what is happening on the lake because it drives the people that are able to have the leisure time to come and use Chautauqua Lake. And this is one of the things that we see in the expansion of interest in the lake, and that is as people do not have to work day in and day out for subsistence existence, the lake becomes more and more attractive to people. Thomas Edison's theory on electrical generation is of extreme importance to us. It comes to us in about 1884, and by 1902, we begin to have the electric cars replacing the animal-drawn vehicles that were part of the mass transit system of those times. We have a very difficult time trying to deal with the agonies of the railroads. Railroads are announced to be built, and it sometimes takes as much as 5 to 10 years before they actually happen, from the time the railroad company is formed. During this period of time, we see a number of entrepreneurs involved with the whole transportation system around the lake. But in the final analysis, the broadheads own it all. And there's a wonderful history that can be read in the documents that I've mentioned earlier. The competition is such that by 1925, the railroad running up the east side of the lake, or the west side of the lake, is closed down. That took me a little bit beyond World War I, didn't it? But the heyday of the railroads, the electric lines, and the activity and the use of them goes from about 1913 to about 1925. And then the ridership begins to disappear. Where? Into the automobile, into roads. Realize that there's no good road system around Chautauqua Lake until we get into the 1900s. And we don't begin to get pavement of any consequence until the 20s. Prior to that, it's muddy spring, just absolute total mud. The people prefer to use the ships. The railroads come down from Mayville to Chautauqua. The railroads come up from Jamestown to Chautauqua to Mayville. There's an electric line all the way into Westfield. I can still talk with people about those types of things There's still people that remember those things. But not too many of them. And one of the things we've got to do is with Devin Taylor and some other people, we've got to get some oral history in Chautauqua County before it's too late. People talking about backing up the hill in their Model T because it won't go up in any of the gears in the forward motion. Those are the types of things. An ice industry that hired literally for months, several months in the winter, hundreds of men and teams to harvest ice from the lake. I'd like you to cast back over to the pamphlets if one of you could, and I'd like to show and concentrate on the picture of the hotel at Chautauqua Institution in that particular booklet to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. This is the hotel that was at Point Chautauqua. Realize that this is one of many of these fantastic wooden palaces that attracted hundreds upon hundreds of people. Some people would come all summer long. There's many pictures in this document about them, but I want to give you the relative size. It's all wood. It's all wood. And of course, this one had a mortgage friction problem and disappeared not too long after it was built. In fact, most of the hotels tragically ended up being burned. We have 2 of the hotels of that period still in existence. And you can get the flavor of what the 1800s were like by going to the Athenaeum at Chautauqua. I can see the women in their gowns and their big, beautiful hats with their handkerchiefs walking along the promenade and into the hotel. Or go over to the Lenhart. The Lenhart is the last privately owned hotel. I say that because the Chautauqua Institution Hotel has been completely rebuilt in the 1980s with the assistance of the Chautauqua County Industrial Agency. But go over to the Lenhart at Bemis Point and look at it. In closing, one of the last questions that I raised for this period of time was, with all of this activity and all of this changing growth around the lake, how is sewage and waste being disposed of? I know that at Bemis Point they had wonderful sands and still have wonderful sands, and maybe most of it was discharged to the sands, but I've got to believe that the acceptable method, in fact, if you read the literature as late as the 1950s, dilution was an acceptable solution to pollution. Wow, that's a good one. So they didn't care about it. But remember that Thomas Crapper showed up in 1882 and gave us the flush siphon toilet that we know today, and gave us a way to use more water to get rid of our human waste. When we get up into the period after World War I, we'll discuss some of the challenges that we have in dealing with waste disposal and its impact on the lake. Remember that all during this period of time, the watershed of the lake is being intensively used for agricultural purposes. We're learning how to use fertilizers. We don't really know how to use fertilizers well until the last decade and a half. And with the amount of land that was being plowed and the amount of livestock in the watershed, we had a nice nutrient loading coming into the lake. And we'll talk in a short time about the challenge that gives us. The lake has gone through a transformation. The railroads came. It became a wonderful, attractive tourist place with thousands of people coming, some of them coming for the whole summer. And if you read the literature, you find that some summers were only 5 weeks long. And normally that winter there might have been a hotel or 2 that were lost to fire. The use of the lake, when you read it, you don't see many pictures of people swimming. You see band concerts, you see parades, you see boating, but you don't see much activity in the water of the lake. Why that is not kept as a record, I don't know. I've got to believe that people swam in the lake. I know that my wife's grandparents swam in the lake. I know that they rowed across the lake. I know that up to World War I, when a motorboat of small type went up the lake, everybody would stand out and watch it because it was such an unusual happening up into World War I.